Hey everybody, and welcome back to Chat Like a Native.
Yeah.
We are diving in today to something that I think is super important. And it's something that comes up all the time when we're trying to learn a new language, especially if we're at like an intermediate level and we really want to start to sound more like a native speaker.
Right.
Like, we can get by, we can say what we want, but how do we actually sound more natural? How do we sound more like, the people that we're listening to and the content that we're consuming with like on this show?
Right.
So today we are talking all about vocabulary, but not necessarily about learning tons and tons of brand new vocabulary.
Right.
It's kind of like upgrading what you already have.
Like leveling up.
Yeah, leveling up.
Your lexicon.
I like that.
Yeah.
So that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today. And hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll have some new techniques, some new resources, and some new ideas about how to actually sound more natural and fluent and really express yourself well.
Yeah. I think there's this idea, and maybe it's perpetuated by like language learning apps and things, that in order to speak a language, we have to learn thousands and thousands of words.
Right.
And that's just not true.
Yeah.
Native speakers don't use thousands and thousands of words in their daily lives.
Whoa.
Most of us use the same few hundred words over and over again.
Yeah.
But the difference is that we use slightly more interesting or precise words than perhaps someone who's learning the language would use, right? So it's not about quantity, it's about quality.
I love that.
It's about really maximizing what you already know. So if you can swap out some of those like very basic words that you learned when you first started learning the language with some slightly more nuanced words or just different synonyms, then you're going to immediately start to sound more like a native speaker.
Right. And I think a lot of times those words, the like very basic words that we learn when we're starting out, they do the job, like they get our point across, but they don't necessarily make the same impact.
Yeah.
Like you were talking about before, if I'm describing a movie that I saw and I say, oh, it was good.
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah, I get my point across.
Yeah.
But what if I say something like, it was riveting, or, it was thought-provoking, or it was hilarious.
Right.
Suddenly you're giving like a much more vivid picture.
Yeah. And you're kind of transmitting more of your own feelings and thoughts about it.
Totally.
So the person listening to you can really get a sense of what you're trying to say.
Right. And not only that, but I think, a lot of times we use those basic words and we think, okay, well, everyone understands what I'm saying.
Right.
But by choosing a word that's a little bit more specific, it actually can make our meaning much clearer. Like, if I'm talking about the weather, I can say, it's cold out.
Yeah.
But what if I say it's frigid, or it's crisp, or it's breezy?
Right.
Like all of those words have a very slightly different meaning.
Yeah.
And they're going to paint a different picture for the person that I'm talking to. So that I think that's a really powerful way to think about vocabulary.
It is.
It's not just about like knowing more words. It's about using the right word for the right situation.
Exactly.
And the other thing is, I think, we were talking before about how like native speakers just sound so confident. And so much of that comes from choosing their words with care.
Yeah.
It gives the listener the impression that, like, this person really knows what they're talking about.
Right.
They've taken the time to really think about what they're saying and how they want to express it.
And also, it's a sign of respect for your listener as well. Because you're taking the time to craft your message.
Totally.
In a way that is going to be clear and interesting for them.
Yeah, I love that.
So those are just a few ideas about why I think it's so important to, not just focus on learning more and more words, but really focus on using the words that we already have in a more thoughtful way.
So what are some of those words that we should be upgrading?
Okay, so let's get into like the nitty gritty. Like what are the words that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, so we all kind of have our crutch words, the words that we fall back on again and again. They can be very frequent words, but they're also quite general. So, words like good, bad, big, small, very nice, really.
Yeah.
These are all perfectly fine words to use, but they don't really add much color or specificity to what you're saying.
Right.
So if you can find a way to swap those words out for something a little more interesting, then immediately your language is going to sound more dynamic.
Right. I think, a good example of this is the word very.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I use that word so much, and half the time I probably don't even need it.
Yeah. I can just choose like a stronger adjective or, be more specific in my description.
And sometimes it's good to just like take it out completely and see if the sentence still works.
Yeah.
Because often it does.
Yeah.
And you don't even need the very.
Right. So I think like a really good first step here is just to become aware of how often we're using these words.
Yeah.
Because like you're saying, they're kind of our crutch words. We use them without even thinking. So if we can just become a little bit more mindful of when we're using them, and then we can start to think about, okay, well, what's a better word that I could use here? What's a more specific word or a more interesting word?
So a good exercise might be to choose one of those words, whether it's good or very or nice.
Yeah.
And for a week, just try and notice how often you use it.
Yeah. I like that.
And, you can just do it in your head. You don't have to, like, write it down or anything. Just make a mental note.
Right.
Every time you use it.
Yeah.
And you'll probably be surprised by how often it comes up.
Yeah. And then once you start to notice it, you can start to think about, okay, well, how can I upgrade this?
Yeah.
So what are some things that we should be thinking about when we're choosing those stronger alternatives?
Yeah. So one really important thing is to think about the connotation of the word. So connotation is basically like the feeling or the association that a word carries.
Right.
Beyond its literal meaning.
Yeah, like how some words that technically mean the same thing can have like a positive or a negative association.
Yeah, right? So like, for example, the words determined and stubborn.
Yeah.
They both mean like you don't give up easily. But determined has a much more positive connotation.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah, so it's really important to think about not just like what the word means, but also what kind of feeling it's going to evoke in the person that you're talking to. Like,
right.
If I'm describing a meal that I had and I say it was awful, that's going to create a very different impression.
Right.
Than if I say it was disappointing or uninspired. Or even disastrous. Like all of those words have slightly different connotations. And so it's about choosing the word that really aligns with the message that you want to send.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's connotation. What else?
Another important thing is to consider the register.
Okay.
So register is basically like the level of formality of your language. So you would speak differently to your boss than you would to your friend.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
So the words that you choose should be appropriate for the situation and the person that you're talking to. So, for example, you might use slang or informal language with your friends.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't use that same language in a job interview.
Right. Totally.
Right.
Like you're not going to call your boss dude.
No, probably not.
Probably not a good idea.
So,
and, thinking about kind of like what we were talking about before with sounding more natural and like a native speaker, one thing that I think is super important is learning about collocations.
Yeah, collocations are really, really important.
And I feel like this is something that's not really talked about enough in language learning.
No.
But it's so important.
It is.
So can you kind of explain what collocations are for people who maybe haven't heard that word before?
Yeah, so collocations are basically words that tend to go together. So certain words just naturally sound better together than others.
Yeah.
Even if the meaning is technically the same. So for example, we say strong coffee.
Yeah.
We don't say powerful coffee.
Right.
Even though powerful and strong kind of mean the same thing. Right. So there are certain words that just naturally collocate with other words.
Right. And I feel like this is something that you just kind of pick up.
Yeah.
Through exposure to the language. But there are actually resources that you can use to help you learn about collocations. Yeah. So like, what are some of those resources?
So one really good one is called ozdic.com.
Okay.
And it's basically a collocation dictionary. So you can type in a word and it will show you all of the words that commonly collocate with that word.
Okay, I love that.
So it's a really good way to just kind of get a sense of like what words naturally go together.
Yeah, and I think that's super important because if you're trying to use a synonym, it's not enough to just know the meaning of the word.
Yeah.
You also need to know, like, how is it actually used in natural language?
Yeah.
And OSDIC can really help you with that. So I think collocations are a really, really important thing to pay attention to if you want to sound more natural and fluent.
Okay, and then taking it a step further, there's something called a corpus.
Okay, yeah, a corpus.
Which is basically like a giant database of text and spoken language. So it's like real-world examples of how language is actually used.
Right.
And one really good one is called the Corpus of Contemporary American English, or COCA.
Okay.
And you can search for words and phrases in COCA, and it will show you how those words and phrases are actually used in context.
I love that because so often, when we're learning new words, we're just looking at like a dictionary definition.
Right.
But a corpus can actually show us like, okay, here are real examples from books, from movies, from conversations of how people are actually using this word.
And you can see, what are the most common collocations? What are the different contexts in which this word is used?
Yeah.
So it's really, really helpful.
So those are some really good resources for, finding out more about the words that you're learning and how to use them correctly. But I think one of the biggest challenges is actually remembering all of this new vocabulary and then actually using it.
Yeah, it's one thing to learn a word. It's another thing to actually use it.
Yeah. So what are some techniques that we can use to really make this vocabulary stick and to make it part of our active vocabulary?
So one good technique is to keep a vocabulary journal.
Okay.
So every time you come across a new word that you want to learn, write it down in your journal.
Yeah.
And I think the most important thing is not just to write down the definition, but to write down a sentence.
Okay.
That shows how that word is used in context.
I like that.
So you're not just memorizing the definition. You're actually seeing how the word is used in a real sentence.
Right. And that's going to help you to remember it better.
Yeah. And you can also make a note of any collocations that you find. So if you find a word in Osdic or QAC, you can write down the collocations in your vocabulary journal as well.
Okay.
And then when you review your journal, you can try and remember the word based on the sentence or the collocations.
Okay. Yeah. So it's more about like actively engaging with the vocabulary rather than just passively reading it.
Right.
Okay. So that's vocabulary journaling. What else?
Another really good technique is spaced repetition.
Okay.
So this is basically the idea that you should review information just before you're about to forget it.
Right.
So there are a lot of different apps and programs that use spaced repetition.
Yeah.
Such as Anki Quizlet Memorize. And you can create flashcards.
Yeah.
With your vocabulary words and sentences.
Yeah.
And the app will show you the words that you're most likely to forget more frequently.
Okay.
So it's a really good way to just kind of keep that vocabulary fresh in your mind.
Right. I think the key with spaced repetition is just to be consistent.
Yeah.
Like even if you just do like 5 or 10 minutes a day, it can really make a big difference over time.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the last technique that I wanted to talk about is chunk learning.
Yeah. So chunk learning is basically the idea that you should learn phrases or chunks of language.
Okay.
Rather than just individual words.
Right.
So for example, instead of just learning the word excellent, you can learn the phrase an excellent job or a first-rate performance.
I like that.
Right? So you're learning these chunks of language
that
you can just kind of plug and play into your conversation.
Right. And I think this is really helpful because it takes the pressure off of you to have to like create every sentence from scratch.
Yeah.
You have these pre-made chunks that you can just kind of insert and it sounds more natural that way.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are some really great techniques for learning and remembering vocabulary.
Yeah.
But, the last piece of the puzzle is actually putting these words into practice.
Yeah, you have to actually use them.
Yeah. So what are some ways that we can actually start to use our upgraded vocabulary in our everyday lives?
So one good way is to do speaking drills.
Okay.
So you can practice different scenarios. So, maybe you imagine that you're giving a presentation.
Yeah.
Or you're having a job interview. And you can practice using your upgraded vocabulary in those situations.
Right. And I think, one thing that's really helpful is to actually record yourself.
Yeah.
Because then you can listen back and you can hear how you sound.
Yeah.
And you can see like, okay, am I using these words correctly? Am I sounding natural?
Yeah.
Am I making any mistakes?
Yeah. And, if you don't want to record yourself, you can always just practice with a friend or a language partner.
Right.
And you can give each other feedback.
Yeah. I love that.
And, another good technique is shadowing.
Okay.
So this is where you listen to audio or video and you repeat what you hear.
Right.
And as you're shadowing, you can try to substitute some of the words with your upgraded vocabulary.
I love that.
So you're kind of like training your brain to think of those alternatives.
Right. Like you're getting used to hearing those words in context, and then you're practicing saying them yourself.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's for speaking. What about writing?
For writing, you can keep a daily journal.
Okay.
And in your journal, you can make a conscious effort to use some of your upgraded vocabulary.
I like that.
And you can also do peer review. So you can exchange writing with a friend or language partner.
Yeah.
And you can give each other feedback on your vocabulary choices.
I think that's really valuable because, sometimes when you're writing, you're so focused on like getting your ideas down.
Yeah.
That you don't always think about the best way to express them.
Right.
So having someone else read your writing and give you feedback can be really helpful.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so those are some techniques for speaking and writing. But what about resources?
Okay, yeah. So what are some resources
that you would recommend for people who want to upgrade their vocabulary?
So we've already talked about Osdic and Cossier. But another really good resource is the Oxford Learners Dictionaries.
Okay.
So these dictionaries are really good because they have lots of example sentences that show you how the words are used in context.
I love that.
And they also have really clear definitions and audio pronunciations. So they're really helpful for learners.
Right.
And then another good resource is thesaurus.com.
Okay.
So this is a website where you can find synonyms for different words.
Right.
But I would say be careful with thesaurus.com.
Yeah.
Because not all synonyms are created equal.
Right.
So you always want to make sure that the synonym that you choose has the right connotation and the right register for the situation.
Totally. And sometimes, a word might be a synonym technically, but it's not actually used in the same way.
Right.
So, always double check. Make sure that it sounds natural.
Yeah.
And one other resource that I wanted to mention is the BBC Learning English website.
Yeah.
They have a lot of really great resources for vocabulary learning, including like quizzes and videos and articles.
Yeah.
So that's a really good one to check out.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are some really great resources. But I think the most important thing is to be consistent.
Yeah.
Like with anything, if you want to improve your vocabulary, you need to make it a habit.
Yeah. So, maybe you could set aside 5 or 10 minutes every day to learn new words.
Yeah.
Or you could make a goal to learn one new word every day.
I like that.
And then you can try and use that word in a conversation or in your writing.
Right. Or even just like throughout your day. If you hear someone use a word that you're trying to learn, make a mental note of it and then try and use it yourself later.
Yeah.
So I think the key is just to make it a part of your everyday life and to not be afraid to experiment.
Yeah. Try out different words.
Yeah.
See what sounds good. See what feels natural.
Right. And I think the more you do that, the more confident you're going to become.
Yeah.
And the more fluent you're going to sound.
So to sum up, I think the most important thing to remember is that improving your vocabulary is not about learning a bunch of obscure words.
Oh, right.
It's about upgrading the words that you already know.
Yeah.
And using them in a more thoughtful and deliberate way.
Totally.
So, be mindful of the words that you're using. Think about the connotation and the register.
Yeah.
Pay attention to collocations. And use resources like Osdic and Cossier to help you learn new words and use them correctly.
And most importantly, don't be afraid to experiment.
Yeah, just try things out. See what works.
Right. And the more you do that, the more natural and fluent you're going to sound.
Yeah.
So I hope this has been helpful for you guys.
Yeah, me too.
And I hope that it inspires you to really start to think about your vocabulary in a new way.
Yeah.
And to really start to upgrade those everyday words that you're using.
So think about this. What message do you want to send with your words?
What a great question.
Yeah.
I love that.
All right. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah. And we will see you next time on Chat Like a Native.
Bye, everybody.